Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hennessy. I'm Stanford's 10th president and a trustee of the Tanner Trust, so I have the honor of welcoming our special speaker today, and who we're really looking forward to, who will give 2 lectures and then participate in 2 discussion sections. Our speaker, Danielle Allen, is the UPS Foundation Professor in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study. And the topic of her lecture today is education and equality. The Tanner Lectures are a long tradition at Stanford, established by Professor Obert Tanner, a industrialist and legal scholar, and a social liberal of amazing amounts at the time at which he lived, including in his company in Salt Lake City, opening one of the first daycare centers so that single moms could come and work in his company. He was received his graduate degree at Harvard and at Stanford, and was a member of our faculty in religious studies. When he established the lecture series offered at several other universities, he hoped that they would, and I quote, contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. Well, he probably meant personkind, but that's okay. I'd like to recognize our colleagues who've helped organize this year's lectures. Please join me in thanking the members of the Bowen McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and the Tanner Lectures Steering Committee for their time and efforts in putting this together. Thank you all. As I said, this year's Tanner Lecture is Danielle Allen, and I've had the opportunity to enjoy a number of her fascinating columns which have appeared in the Washington Post. And range across topics as varied as academics in public life, to MOOCs and their role in the world, to the one I loved the most, Danielle, the importance of the humanities in study and education. So I'm looking forward to her talk. These lectures provide us an opportunity to explore essential human questions, and certainly Professor Allen has done that through her career. In her teaching, her books, her public commentary, and her community engagement, she has challenged her students, colleagues, and fellow citizens to reflect on issues of justice, citizenship, and education. Educated both as a classicist and a political scientist, Professor Allen is widely recognized for the originality that underlies her work. She grew up in California and surrounded by books, with a mother that was a research librarian and a father who was a professor of political science. She earned her undergraduate degree in classics from Princeton University, where her advisor was none other than our own Josh Obert. Stories about that will be held tomorrow night when Josh will introduce Danielle. After Princeton, she continued her study of classics as a Marshall Scholar at Cambridge, where she earned her MPhil and PhD in classics, but that was not enough in the degree world, so she returned to that other Cambridge on the east coast of the United States, earning her MA and PhD in political science from Harvard. In 1997, she joined the faculty at the University of Chicago, where she held appointments in political science, classical languages and literatures, and the Committee on Social Thought. She was also recognized at that time as an outstanding teacher. In 2002, she was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for her ability, and I quote, to combine the classicist's careful attention to text and language with the political theorist's sophisticated and informed engagement. She served as Dean of the Division of the Humanities for several years before leaving Chicago in 2007 to assume her current position at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Professor Allen is also the author of a number of books, among them Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of a Citizenship Since Brown versus the Board of Education, Why Plato Wrote, and published earlier this year a book that has been widely acclaimed, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. I thought the best quote on this book was Cornel West, who says, "This wise and rich book is what we need in these troubled times. A robust and persuasive defense of equality and liberty grounded in our sacred national scripture." Danielle Allen is a towering political philosopher of the democratic art of being a force for good. Her intellectual interests are combined with a deep engagement, as I mentioned, in community affairs and the day-to-day lives of people around her. In Chicago, she established the Civic Knowledge Project to strengthen connections between the university and its neighbors. She also worked on the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, which maintained an archive of primary source materials about African American culture, history, and politics in Chicago. And she taught in the Illinois Humanities Council's Odyssey Project, an effort that brings education in the humanities to low-income adults. This is not the first time we've been fortunate enough to have Danielle here. In 2008, she gave the inaugural lecture in the Aurora Forum on Education for Citizenship. And so it was with great anticipation that we look forward to her talk today on education and equality. Tomorrow, she will give a session with our commentators in the morning, and then tomorrow afternoon at 5:30 in the same place, a second lecture on participatory readiness. And then on Friday, another discussion session will occur with our distinguished commentators. Shortly after receiving the MacArthur, Professor Allen was interviewed in the Chicago Maroon. She described herself in this way, and I quote, "I'm a nerd. I love to read. That's what I did when I was a kid." Well, Professor Allen, this is Nerd Nation. The place where everybody takes pride in being a nerd, and we're delighted to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Allen.
Thank you so much, President Hennessy, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Glad to be in Nerd Nation, absolutely, that's my home in one form or another, wherever I am. Though I'm embarrassed to be reminded that in 2008 I came here and spoke on the subject of education and citizenship, because you're going to think, can't this lady move on? She's just sort of stuck on the same subject. So at any rate, I'm glad to, let's see if I've learned something since I was here in 2008. I certainly hope so. It's a huge privilege and honor to be asked to give the Tanner Lectures, one of the most distinguished lecture events in the space of political philosophy and the humanities. And it's an interesting assignment because you're asked to prepare a text that's submitted to commentators in advance and that goes to the Tanner Foundation, which means, in fact, also that it's, in some sense, a rather old-fashioned lecture series. And so I've got a written text, which I'm going to read. I do have PowerPoint as well. And it will take about an hour. So I just want to warn you that you said you were nerds. OK, I'm going to put that to the test. So here we go. Education and equality. Let me begin just by telling you where we're headed in this lecture. I'll introduce the problem that's been plaguing me, at least since 2008, as President Hennessy suggested. I'm going to propose that we get stuck on thinking about education because we mix up two different concepts of it. It may seem at first that those are the vocational and the liberal, but I'm going to suggest a different pairing. And as a result of that, I'm going to lead us to what I call a humanistic baseline for defining education. This will then lead me to an account of 4 basic needs that education ought to meet. And then I'll use those basic needs, the humanistic baseline, to think about how we might inflect some of our educational policy questions. So that's the course of events for today's lecture. So, to the problem. We are currently awash in torrents of public conversation about education. As of early October, Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, had 43,334 tweets to her name. Obviously, she's not doing it herself. For the past 12 months alone, the New York Times archive generates 178,000 articles on education. And education is among Americans' top 10 political concerns out of a list of some 35 issues on a regular basis. There's so much talk about education that one can't help but think that perhaps the most sensible thing to do would be just get on with it, quit conversing and get back to teaching. So, in other words, maybe I and these lectures are actually part of some kind of problem, not the solution. But aside from their sheer volume, the other notable feature of our countless public conversations about education is how many of them have to do with equality. In 2009, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich and the Reverend Al Sharpton famously joined up for a public tour to advocate educational reform. they identified problems in education as a civil rights issue of our time. Similarly, our many public conversations about income inequality inevitably turn to the topic of education. Thus, Thomas Piketty, in his recent book Capital in the 21st Century, writes, historical experience suggests that the principal mechanism for convergence of incomes at the international as well as the domestic level is the diffusion of knowledge. In other words, the poor catch up with the rich to the extent that they achieve the same level of technological know-how, skill, and education. He's not the first to make this point. The influential economists Claudia Golden and Larry Katz do so as well, for instance, in their book, The Race Between Education and Technology. Here, too, I must count myself as part of this problem, or if not a problem, then at least the phenomenon of a durable societal obsession with education and equality. For nearly 5 years now, or even longer, 6 years, I've been going around giving lectures under the title Education and Equality. I haven't, however, been plowing a single furrow. My arguments have constantly shifted, and my experience has been of pursuing a highly elusive object of analysis. An adequate framework for thinking about the relationship between education and equality has felt always just beyond reach. Over the course of my constant worrying of this topic, I've made normative arguments that ideal educational institutions in a democratic society ought to lift the educational level of the entire population as high as possible, while also making it possible for those with special gifts to achieve the highest heights of intellectual and creative excellence, and simultaneously ensuring that the pathways to those highest heights can be entered into by anyone from any social position. Imagine a Western Mesa, but one that has jutting out of it peaks like the Rockies, with trailheads for the ascent of each peak marked plainly and boldly. I've also made policy arguments. For instance, surprisingly in my book on the Declaration, I make the case that the achievement of such an ideal requires reforming our approaches to zoning and municipal policy. I've argued that we need to commit public funding to early childhood education, community colleges, and public universities, that we should distribute admissions tickets to elite colleges and universities by means of geographic lotteries over a basic threshold of achievement, that we should construct tuition and aid policies based on transparency about what any given institution actually spends on educating a student, and that we ought to broadly disseminate the competencies, aptitudes, and skills necessary to convert social relationships that are currently costly, namely those that bridge boundaries of social difference, into relationships that bring mutual benefit. Yet for all the pages and PowerPoint slides, I don't feel that I've been able to come to a resting point in my account of the relationship between education and equality. With these lectures and your help, I'm hoping to put this insistent intellectual problem to bed at last. Why exactly is it so hard to think about education and equality in relation to each other? There is, of course, the fact that equality is simply a difficult concept to talk about. I often find that students think that to say two things are equal is to say that they're the same. But of course, equal and same are not synonyms. To be the same is to be identical, but to be equal is to have an equivalent degree of some specific quality or attribute compared to someone else. To talk about equality, one must always begin by asking, equal to whom and in what respect? Importantly, the effective use of a concept of equality in socio-political contexts requires that one pinpoint whether one means human equality, political equality, social equality, or economic equality. Or perhaps in place of the last, one will replace an idea of economic equality with an ideal of economic justice, or fairness, or opportunity. Then there are relations among each of these types of equality. I think clarifying those relationships is among the most important tasks of political philosophy, especially in our present moment. Yet when we invoke the concept of equality in our conversations about education, for the most part, we don't bother to define what we actually mean by it, or to identify which aspect of human experience we wish to pick out for analysis. Beyond the simple fact that we often leave the idea of equality unspecified in our conversations about educational policy, another issue, too, stirs up my vague unease with how we commonly invoke the concept in these discussions. The quotation from Piketty's Capital that I read just a moment ago is revealing, so let me read a bit of it again. In other words, the poor catch up with the rich to the extent that they achieve the same level of technological know-how, skill, and education. Note that the problem that education is here used to solve is that of poverty, or at least of unequal income and/or wealth distributions. This tracks our most common way of discussing equality in relation to education. Discussions of educational reform are very often proxies for conversations about poverty, perhaps too difficult to have. And insofar as this is the case, it is often unclear how much the conversation actually concerns education itself. Similarly, if one returns to my normative picture and policy prescriptions, the mesa with its peaks, the policies about funding, admission, and municipal planning, you'll find that the picture I have painted is entirely about the egalitarian funding and allocation or distribution of some good called education, but not particularly about whatever the actual good called education fundamentally is. In other words, for all our talk about education and equality, we don't actually talk very much about how education itself, in itself, relates to equality, regardless of whether the equality we have in mind is human, political, or social, or connected to economic fairness. All this brings me to the basic problem that motivates these lectures. I think that education itself, a practice of human development, has intrinsic to that practice important contributions to make to the defense of human equality as an idea, to the cultivation of political and social equality in fact, and to the emergence of fair economic orders. But I think we have lost sight of just how education in itself, and putting aside questions of funding and distribution, relates to those egalitarian concerns. If we are to do right by the students we purport to educate, in whatever context and at whatever level, I think we need to recover that vision. Consequently, my goal for these lectures will be to effect a recovery of our understanding of just how education and equality are intrinsically connected to each other. So here's the plan for what follows. First, I begin with some conceptual cleanup work. Drawing on the philosophers John Rawls and Hannah Arendt, I hope to secure some basic conceptual architecture for thinking about education. This work will establish what I call a humanistic baseline for understanding what education is. This cleaned up understanding of education should help clarify our conversations about our goals for both schooling and higher ed. This will be the main work of this first lecture, and I'll wrap it up by examining just how a humanistic baseline for understanding the meaning of education might help us reframe key policy questions. In my second lecture, I'll turn to the specific policy domain that appears most freshly lit by my account. This is the domain that many people refer to as civic education. I argue that we should reorient ourselves to a concept of participatory readiness, and I will lay out a proposed framework for thinking about the desirable content of a new approach to cultivating such participatory readiness. This readiness is actually of critical relevance to other egalitarian concerns, including economic ones, and I will suggest that the cultivation of participatory readiness, in all probability, depends fundamentally on the humanistic aspects of the curriculum. In other words, the identification of the humanistic baseline for establishing a justification for education will turn out, in fact, to have provided a foundation for a defense of the humanities, as well as the beginnings of an explanation for how education in itself has egalitarian potential. This means, of course, that the fates of the humanities and so-called civic education are likely to rise and fall together. In sum, the task of these lectures is to clarify our understanding of education, its intrinsic connection to equality, and the relevance of the study of the humanities to education's intrinsic egalitarian potentialities. So on to the two concepts of education, the vocational versus the liberal. For all the talk about education in contemporary culture, do we actually have an adequate framework for saying what it is? As an object of anthropological and sociological analysis, education is a relative newcomer. Emile Durkheim and W.E. Du Bois launched the sociology of education in the late 19th century, but sustained interest didn't emerge until after World War II, when the field of anthropology of education came into its own. The late inclusion of education among the practices that an anthropologist or sociologist might study reflects the fact that many of the earliest templates of these disciplines, and so here I'm thinking of the work of people like Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, Fustel de Coulanges, Henry Maine, and Max Weber, such early forefathers of anthropology and sociology began their work from analyses of Western antiquity, where education was generally not an autonomous social practice, but dependent on other social forms. For instance, in ancient Greece, religious ritual, legal practices, military training, and so on, largely provided the context for training the young. Some ancients could conceive of education as an autonomous field of social practice, so for instance Plato and Aristotle, but their anticipation of systems of education was largely unmatched in practice. Sparta stands as an exception, of course. In contrast to the Western tradition, China's extensive network of formal educational institutions began its development in the 3rd millennium BCE. It's an extraordinary historical difference. Only once a social practice is autonomous, that is to say, conducted through rituals or institutions built for the sake of that practice and no other, can it be said to have a logic, and also a structure of action-guiding principles and rules emergent from that logic. In addition to focusing on autonomous social practices, anthropologists and sociologists have sought to understand their conversion into socio-political practices. By this conversion, I mean the moment when legitimate public officials acquire authority for a practice that has previously been managed mostly by private individuals. As, for instance, when a society gives up allowing individuals to effect retribution for wrongdoing through methods of self-help, and instead designates public authorities to manage responses to wrongdoing. This is the moment when social practices of revenge instead become a socio-political practice of punishment. In other words, at various points in history, phenomena like revenge, possession of land, mating, and raiding were co-opted by newly developing political regimes and turned into punishment, property, markets, marriage, and war. In the history of Western socio-political development, we can say that revenge had become punishment by at least 800 BCE. Although, as it happens, this transition had to be effected more than once, not only in antiquity, but again in the medieval period. Education didn't undergo an equivalent conversion until well after antiquity had faded away. The first versions of Western educational institutions were scribal training centers in ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East, and philosophical and rhetorical and medical schools, as well as early schools for children in Greece and Rome. Then, over the course of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, educational institutions took shape through the development of centers of religious training in different monotheistic traditions, including the emergence of universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford in the 11th century. The emergence of these institutions was followed by others. To pick out just two examples, the establishment in England of schools for poor boys, which means Winchester and Eton. These were established as feeders for poor boys to new universities. And then, of course, during the Renaissance, there were schools to train artists in the atelier of particular painters. But the processes by which political authorities established universal or compulsory education began in Europe only in the 17th century, and in the US was completed only in 1918, when the last of the states then in the Union made education, up to the age of 16 at least, compulsory. As a consequence of the relatively late arrival in Western history of education as a fully autonomous socio-political practice on a par with punishment, economics, and war, scholars are actually still in the early stages of coming to understand its logic. Despite the relative youthfulness of education as a state practice, it might seem, however, that our current public conversations about education don't actually evidence any confusion or uncertainty about its nature. This is one of the few areas of public policy where politicians from both major parties tend to say roughly the same thing. Both Democrats and Republicans clearly articulate what could reasonably be called a neoliberal educational agenda, with a focus on educating the national population to succeed in global market competition. So here's Barack Obama from the 2012 Democratic National Convention. I promise you we can out-educate and out-compete any nation on earth. Help me recruit 100,000 math and science teachers within 10 years and improve early childhood education. Help give 2 million workers the chance to learn skills at their community colleges that will lead directly to a job. Help us work with colleges and universities to cut in half the growth of tuition costs over the next 10 years. We can meet that goal together. You can choose that future for America. And then here's Mitt Romney, also 2012. I'm running for president to help create a better future, a future where everyone who wants a job can find one, where no senior fears for the security of their retirement, an America where every parent knows that their child will get an education that leads them to a good job and a bright horizon. Second, we will give our fellow citizens the skills they need for the jobs of today and the careers of tomorrow. When it comes to the school your child will attend, every parent should have a choice, and every child should have a chance. The rhetorical affinities extend beyond the presidential campaign trail. Both candidates echoed the language of the preamble to the bipartisan Common Core college and career readiness state standards, which were created and promoted by the National Governors Association. Here's a portion of that preamble. The Common Core state standards define the rigorous skills and knowledge in English language arts and mathematics that need to be effectively taught and learned for students to be ready to succeed academically in credit-bearing, college entry courses, and in workforce training programs. The standards developed will set the stage for US education, not just beyond next year, but for the next decade, and they must ensure all American students are prepared for the global economic workplace. In other words, in this country, we seem to know just what we should be pursuing in education: college and career readiness as preparation for the global economy. Given that this goal is backed by state power generated by the richest and most powerful government the world has ever known, we have to take seriously the idea that it is of considerable consequence for the future of our own culture at least. What exactly is the cultural consequence of constructing an educational system around this goal of college and career readiness as preparation for the global economy? As our public conversations have unfolded, the reigning political ideology in education has generated the common critique that the orientation is overly vocational. The story of how such a vocationally oriented frame of global competitiveness came to dominate is familiar. The Soviet launch of the first satellite in 1957 provoked a sense that this country was falling behind in a Cold War scientific contest. The response was the National Defense of Education Act, signed into law in 1958. Then in 1983, the Reagan-era report, A Nation at Risk, further spurred the view that the US was falling behind. Although its data was later debunked, it included provocative summary sentences such as, if an unfriendly power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. Although it's funny because then you'll see this nice, the language was quite incendiary, but the visuals get more incendiary over time. So that 83 report is understood to have kicked off the era of school reform that still shapes educational discussion and policy. And in 2007, the National Academy of Sciences put out this next one, a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. This emphasized the need for significant improvements in science and technology education and investment. The report's authors wrote, quote, an educated, innovative, motivated workforce, human capital, is the most precious resource of any country in this new flat world. Yet there is widespread concern about our K-12 science and mathematics education system, the foundation of that human capital in today's global economy. This influential report has impacted educational policy conversations, driving an increase of focus on STEM fields, as I'm sure you all know. We can see the impact in Obama's 2013 State of the Union address when he announced a competition to redesign America's high schools. Rewards would go, he said at the time, to schools that develop more classes that focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, quote, the skills today's employers are looking for to fill jobs right now and in the future. Those who critique this educational vision typically invoke the liberal arts by way of contrast. Of course, a straightforward dichotomy between vocational and liberal learning is relevant mostly in the context of elite colleges and universities. As Louis Menand has argued, such campuses often suffer from an allergy to the term vocational. Nonetheless, the antithesis between vocational and liberal that has developed on college campuses structures our broader debates about the purposes of education. And those debates can come to feel stuck in a simple and endless tug of war between those two poles. Is the point of education the life of the mind or an effort to secure a job? Of course it's both, and it is in fact possible to get past this blockage in public conversation. We can do so by recognizing that our conversations about education have the shape they do because we are operating with two different concepts of education. So in the next section, I'd like to clarify those two concepts in order to lead us to a resolution of the seeming opposition between the vocational and the liberal arts conceptions of education. So on we go to our two concepts. So those of you who are philosophers will already know that in referring to two concepts of education, I'm riffing on John Rawls, who in 1955 published an important essay called Two Concepts of Rules. In this early paper, Rawls pointed out that the perpetual debates among penal theorists over whether the proper justification for punishment was deterrent, and therefore utilitarian, or retributive, and so based on a commonplace morality, stem from a failure to understand the logic of practices, of which punishment was one of his two examples. Promise-keeping was his other example. He argued, following David Hume, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and John Austin, that for any given practice, there is a distinction between justifying a practice and justifying a particular action falling under it. As an example, there is a distinction between justifying punishment and justifying punishing. The first kind of justification requires answering the question, why does the state generally punish people? The second kind of justification requires answering the question, why did the state punish that man? According to Rawls, the answer to the latter question requires a retributive statement. That particular man was punished as a response to the wrong he had done and in proportion to that wrong. The answer to the question of why states may generally punish, however, can be utilitarian, says Rawls. It might be something like this: in order to keep wrongdoing to a minimum by deterring would-be wrongdoers through the example of the punishments of others. But Rawls' neat formulation obscures a few other important distinctions. When we ask, why does the state generally punish people, we're actually asking two questions. First, why has punishment come to exist as an institution that distinguishes human social organization from hives and galaxies? And second, why is the state justified in operating institutions of punishment? The first question seeks a causal explanation. The second question seeks a justification for state action. So let's take the game of baseball as an example. That's Rawls' example. So I'm still stealing from Rawls. The emergence of the game as a social practice, its very existence, is explained by ends of leisure. But the actions of individuals falling under the game, swinging at balls, running around bases, catching and throwing balls, are justified by the goal not of leisure, but of victory, of scoring more runs than an opponent. And the actions of corporate actors who've co-opted the game of baseball to develop, for instance, a professional version of the sport, are justified by the goal of profit. The ends which explain the emergence of the practice, the ends which justify the effort to regulate the practice, and the ends which justify actions undertaken within it are all three logically separate. If they turn out to be the same, that coincidence is purely accidental. Thus, it can be a matter of social utility that practices should arise and be co-opted by the state, for which the ends of the actions falling under them are not utilitarian, but either moral or eudaimonistic. So what do I mean by eudaimonistic? That term comes from the Greek word for happiness, eudaimonia, and designates an ethical outlook organized around the effort of individuals to achieve full human flourishing by means of the development of their internal capacities. The case of education is like that of punishment. Analysts of education move in a perpetual circle when they argue over its proper justification. Is it economic competitiveness, or the development of citizens, or enablement of eudaimonistic human flourishing? We need to recognize that, as with punishment, the logic of education makes two different kinds of justification relevant. There's the justification for the state's maintenance of a system of education, and the justification for particular instances of teaching carried out within that system. In order to draw out that point, let's consider again the very different schools that emerged in different historical periods prior to the nationalization of education. So again, scribal training centers, philosophical, medical, and rhetorical schools, theological programs, universities, and schools of artists. These educational institutions were founded for different reasons. Scribal training centers, for instance, to help rulers control their property and the flow of goods. Religious training centers to prepare priests and theologians and thereby supply religious organizations with manpower. These different schools were thus directed toward diverse ends. But in terms of the activity that occurred within them, which allows classification of all these institutions as fundamentally about the same thing, namely education, all shared the aspiration to direct the development of human capacities. While the institutions of formal education arise on the basis of diverse justifications, within these different institutions, the activity of education and all the techniques developed to pursue it are identified by a single end: cultivating human development. This is true even when a student chooses a vocational training course for the sake of making money. In order for that training to succeed, it must still affect the development of the student qua human being, for that is what it means for any of us to cultivate capacities and abilities. In our current context, then, it's entirely reasonable that the justification for the co-option of education by the state, for the conversion, that is, of education into a socio-political practice, might be utilitarian. The state asserts authority over education as a matter of securing social reproduction. Achieving this requires economic and/or military competitiveness for the state and preservation of its state form. In the context of a democracy, the system-level justification for education therefore entails a twinned utilitarian concern for generating economic or military competitiveness and for producing citizens prepared to maintain democratic life. But the justification for the actions falling under the practice, particular instances of educating, the micro level of justification, can't be, I would say, utilitarian. What do I mean by that strong statement? Clearly, people do often provide utilitarian, or more broadly, consequentialist justifications for education, including at the micro or individual level. Economists, for instance, distinguish between the consumption and investment benefits of education, or between intrinsic and extrinsic benefits. As Helen Ladd and Susanna Loeb put it, intrinsic benefits arise when education is valued for its own sake, such as the pleasure of being able to solve a complex problem or appreciate artistic expression, and extrinsic benefits arise when education serves as an instrument for the attainment of other valued outcomes, such as the higher income for working parents that is facilitated by having children in school, or the potential for the recipients of education to seek higher paying jobs and fulfilling careers than would otherwise be possible. But when one scrutinizes the extrinsic benefits that are most often identified as flowing from education, higher paying jobs for instance, one notices that education is only one means of achieving those ends. One might, for instance, also obtain a higher paying job through cronyism. So the extrinsic ends might justify activities other than education. In no way do they necessarily justify education itself. The ends which define education as education, in contrast, and which thereby provide its proper justification, must be ends that can be achieved only through education, and these are ends of human development pursued as such. Our considered moral judgment, to crib again from Rawls, is that the state of affairs where a person has been educated is better than if she had not been, and it is better for her own sake, regardless of any consequence of educating her. We recognize educating as educating across different instances of it, because in all cases, one party has undertaken to spur the positive human development of another. Across the different examples of education, what counts as success is the activation in the student of positive capacities that had previously been latent. Moreover, we care about the activation of those valuable capacities regardless of the consequences. We don't, for instance, cease educating the child who has cancer because she has cancer. This is not to say that the consequences that flow from activating latent and valuable human capacities are unimportant, just that those consequences do not themselves justify the activation. The important point here is that even when a student pursues education as a means to money-making, she's choosing as her means an activity whose form is built around a different set of ends. Of course, as Aristotle long ago pointed out, the ends of money-making and of human flourishing are not separate from one another. In order to achieve a broad eudaimonistic human flourishing, we also need the means to live. Close attention to the logic of education reveals any strong distinction between utilitarian and eudaimonistic goals to be overdrawn. Similarly, even if one thinks that one needs to teach a child his tribe's rituals in order to preserve that tribe, a collective utilitarian concern, one also thinks that the life in that tribe is in the child's best interest, and that's a eudaimonistic perspective. So one's view about inculcating social norms is tethered to a view about the child's good. An educational system is constituted by a multitude of particular actions that involve the relation between teachers and students, where each student must always be an end in himself. When we try to cultivate good teachers, we seek to instill this instinct. This effort flows from the moral intuition that the appropriate justification for the actual activity of educating is a broad eudaimonism, not social utility. Rawls's neat distinction, then, between the justification for rules that structure practices and the justification for rules that structure the activities conducted in the context of that practice helps us to see that thinking about education requires us to think on two levels. And we have to understand when each level of justification is relevant. It is reasonable to think about social utility and about how a whole educational system might achieve social utility. It may even be necessary to do that. But the justification for particular instances of educating must instead be eudaimonistic. What we are thinking about as education won't count as such unless we also think about it from the perspective of the individual being educated. In order to count as education, the practice sponsored by so-called educational institutions needs to affect the development of an individual qua human being, namely a creature whose flourishing entails the development of a range of valuable cognitive, affective, and intersubjective capacities. I refer to this as the humanistic baseline for the concept of education. So now from the humanistic baseline to the four needs. The next sort of question we have to ask is this. If any given system of education, regardless of the social ends to which it is directed, must meet a humanistic baseline in order to count as a system specifically of education, how do we determine what is involved in meeting that humanistic baseline? What sort of education activates latent potential for general human flourishing? This is also to ask which account of human flourishing we should use to give content to the humanistic baseline for education. As we pursue an answer to this question, we will also have to ask whether it is possible to have an approach to education that integrates the two perspectives provided by its system and its micro-level justifications. A coherent account of the purposes of education surely requires such an integration or alignment. As we initiate our hunt for an acceptable eudaimonistic account of the nature of education, we can define the stakes of the search by reaching back again, if briefly, to the first theorist of education in the Western tradition. Plato argued that the differences among people are such that each should be educated to perform excellently the one kind of work at which she will excel. This would make us all virtuous and therefore happy, he argued, as would assuming our places in a highly stratified society, in which adults perform the single role assigned to them, for instance, political leadership or military service, craftsmanship, trading, or agriculture. But this is not a democratic answer to the question thrown up by the logic of practices of how to justify not merely the institutions of education, but also the actions undertaken while educating. And just as Plato's answer is anti-democratic, so too is it illiberal, even if only avant la lettre. Liberalism depends on the idea that the ends of the state and of the individual are separable to a meaningful degree. Plato, of course, argued the opposite view, that city and soul cannot ultimately adopt divergent aims. He achieved an integration of the system-level justification for education and the action-specific justification by proposing a form of education whose purpose was to fit each individual to his assigned social role. Against Plato, a democratic answer to the question of the kind of education that would achieve full human flourishing starts from a different view of human nature, namely that despite the differences among us, we're all capable of doing multiple jobs. It's not exactly a very elegant portrayal of the idea that we have these amazingly flexible multiple capacities, but it was the best I could do. So if you have ideas about other ways of illustrating this notion that human beings can do many jobs at once, please let me know. I would like to replace the Swiss Army knife. So, and at the very least, the jobs that we can do, the multiple jobs, include both performing our own individual excellence and also acting politically as citizens. To flesh out a democratic account of full human flourishing, we would profit, I think, from turning now to the work of another mid-20th century philosopher, not often considered alongside Rawls. The person I have in mind is Hannah Arendt. Her 1958 book, The Human Condition, is driven by consideration of the issue of well-being from the perspective of the individual instead of the social whole. Given the historical proximity of Rawls's 1955 article and Arendt's 1958 book, it's perhaps not surprising that there should be resonances between them. More surprising is that the lines of thought in contemporary political philosophy that flow from each rush on so separately from one another. Interestingly, Arendt's account in The Human Condition provides a valuably democratic account of human flourishing that can serve as a foundation for integrating our two concepts of education, the macro-level social utilitarian concept and the micro-level eudaimonistic concept. In The Human Condition, Arendt famously expounds on the content and import of three core human activities: labor, work, and action. Labor is what we undertake out of biological necessity, what we do, in other words, to feed ourselves. It also encompasses sexual reproduction and the energies devoted to child rearing. Work is what we do out of creative effort to build things, whether physical or cultural, that shape our world and establish our social connections with others. Labor and work overlap with each other, since our romantic relationships are products of our social art, and of course create the context within which we may also pursue biological reproduction. Finally, action identifies the effort we make together as political creatures, struggling in conditions of pluralistic diversity to come to collective decisions about our polity's course of action. Arendt's arguments about labor, work, and action have garnered significant scholarly attention. Yet one important detail has been overlooked. By describing work, labor, and action as typifying every human existence, Arendt sought to reverse centuries, even millennia, of philosophical effort to differentiate social roles with reference to these activities. Earlier philosophers had assigned to a different social class each of the three domains of activity that for Arendt defined the human condition of each individual. In the idealized Greek city of Aristotle, for instance, securing a stable economic base of life was assigned to a slave class. Contributing to the realm of creativity was assigned to craftsmen, and participating in politics to citizens. Or think again of that image of Plato I had, who had assigned those tasks to farmers, traders, craftsmen, soldiers, and political leaders, and expected very little mobility among these groups. With her incandescent and liberatory philosophical imagination, Arendt de-differentiated these three roles and recombined them. She brought them back together again into an account of the single experience of every individual, as themselves the marks of the human condition. On an Arendtian account, the potential of the modern union of economics and politics is that we can build polities that are non-stratified, such that each individual is responsible for securing his own subsistence rather than exploiting others, has a life scope that makes it possible to create meaningful social worlds, both intimate and communal, and has a platform for participating in politics. Individual human flourishing, then, depends on the activation of a potential that inheres in all human beings as a feature of the human condition, to succeed at labor, work, and action simultaneously. On the basis of Arendt's arguments in human condition, then, we can identify four basic human potentialities that should be activated by education. Through education, we need to prepare ourselves for breadwinning work, to prepare ourselves for civic and political engagement, to prepare ourselves for creative self-expression and world-making, and to prepare ourselves for rewarding relationships in spaces of intimacy and leisure. We recognize that the capacities relevant to all these domains are flourishing when we see young people become adults who can support themselves economically without exploiting others, who can take their place among a world of adult creators, including as creators of rewarding intimate relationships, and who can participate effectively in their polity's political life. When the humanistic baseline for the micro-level concept of education is given content from such a democratic eudaimonism, it orients us toward a pedagogic practice that is in itself egalitarian, and that it seeks to meet the same range of needs for all students. Yet there is another way in which this conceptualization of education makes a contribution to egalitarianism. When one takes a look at this list of basic educational needs generated from Arendt's democratic eudaimonism, one quickly notices that the utilitarian social justifications for a system of education, namely that of polity, secure economic competitiveness, and an engaged citizenry, those two system-level justifications align with two of the four needs that any individual has from education. Each person's individual needs to prepare for breadwinning work and for civic and political engagement are simply the other side of the coin of the social need for broad economic competitiveness and an engaged citizenry. Sorry about that. In other words, public goods and private goods come together here. And analyzing education in terms of an opposition between them is not necessarily helpful. Similarly, the state's utilitarian goods turn out to be features of an individual's eudaimonistic good, if merely considered from a different perspective. Although a state seeks an economically successful population, each individual, too, flourishes only when her potential for successful labor is appropriately activated. And although a democracy needs an engaged and effective citizenry, each individual flourishes only when his potential for action is appropriately tapped. When we see how the social and the individual come together, bringing the two concepts of education into alignment with each other, we also learn something important about our own contemporary conversations about education. Our current conversations emphasize only one of the social justifications for education, namely the economic, leaving the state's need to cultivate effective citizens largely to the side. I'll return to that topic in my next lecture, but that's where the truly egalitarian work of this humanistic concept of education is done. Yet for all the surprising proximity, then, between the system-level goals of education and the individual-level goals that emerge from the eudaimonistic account, we should also be grateful that the alignment between social goals and our individual goals is only partial. It should be a cause of relief that two of the basic needs defining the humanistic baseline for education, the needs for creative self-expression and world-making, and for rewarding relationships in spaces of intimacy and leisure, do not align with the system-level justifications for education. We don't want the state to colonize our social lives as creatures who build worlds with others through creative self-expression and who pursue rewarding relationships in spaces of intimacy and leisure. Yet while we don't want the state to colonize those spaces, we do need to ensure that the state leaves space for them. That is, if in failing to see those spaces, the state begins to override them, then that is simply another form of colonization. And this brings us to the topic of how the humanistic baseline for education might point us toward a reorientation of our education policy discussions generally. So, in sum, to wrap up this point about the two concepts, Rawls helped us to see that we must consider the goals of educational systems on the one hand, the social utility concept, and the goals of teachers with specific students on the other, the individual flourishing question. Arendt offers us a eudaimonism that permits bringing social and individual goods into alignment with one another on a democratic footing. Thinking clearly about education, however, requires shifting effectively back and forth between these two registers, the social and the individual, categories that track neither a public good, private good distinction, nor a simplistic utilitarian, non-utilitarian distinction. If the state is to support a system of education that remains a system of education as distinct from some other practice, it needs to leave institutions room to educate such that their pedagogic practices can meet the requirements of the humanistic baseline to attend to individual flourishing. So let's turn now, for the final section, to the question of education policy. This idea of two concepts of education should affect reflection on educational policy by requiring us to consider any given policy proposal through each of two lenses. We can assess a policy for its success in meeting the social goods we have in view, perhaps global economic competitiveness, but we also need to assess the policy by asking whether the actions it requires and the institutions it establishes also satisfy the humanistic baseline that justifies actually teaching. Let me illustrate this point very briefly with a few schematic remarks about the policy topic of accountability. Once one sees that there are in fact two kinds of justification relevant to education, one realizes that there must also be two kinds of accountability relevant to the practice. The system of education as a whole needs to be held account in relation to the utilitarian justification, which justify drawing the social practice of education within the political realm in the first place. But individual and particular instances of teaching need to be held account in relation to the eudaimonistic justification that should properly structure the relationship between teacher and student. Does our present approach to accountability employ such a distinction? No, as you might imagine, I'd say it does not. We wish to hold the system as a whole accountable for the production of economically competitive citizens, but to do so, we test individual children, and not for each child's own sake, but in order to track change over time in the performance of student cohorts. Individual students are, in other words, made the instruments of judging something other than themselves and their own flourishing. System-level practices of accountability should instead be constructed out of measures that can capture system-wide effects without interfering with the individual teacher-student relationship. We need measurement that touches the system as such, not the particular moves or actions made within it. Such measures are available, and imaginative educational reformers have already identified some. So Larry Rosenstock, now of High Tech High in San Diego, a few years ago proposed that we should track, instead of doing lots of testing, the following kinds of facts. Of the entering ninth graders in a given educational entity, a school or district or a state, what percent graduated from a four-year college? Of those students who qualify for free or reduced lunch of those ninth grade entrants, what percentage graduated from a four-year college? Of those ninth graders not in poverty, what percent graduated from a four-year college? And what relative mixtures of those two categories of students were most efficacious for getting the free and reduced lunch students through college? So this would be an alternative set of indicators to indicate the quality of an educational system. Similarly, researchers at the Chicago Consortium for School Research had developed an extensive set of indicators to assess the quality of work done by schools and teachers in fostering academic achievement. These indicators are developed on the basis of measures that perform better than standardized tests in predicting student achievement. They also make use of readily available data that are independently generated by the practice of educating, so using this data does not interfere with educating. One of their recommended indicators is the on-track status of ninth graders in any given school, and that's a status that was defined in relation to attendance, grades, and course pass rates. And the on-track status, their research shows, is a better predictor of high school graduation than 8th grade test scores or socioeconomic status. Moreover, identification of this first indicator allows for the development of others. Since schools that cultivate strong student-teacher relationships, make high school relevant for students, and engage their students, average fewer failures, better grades, and better attendance, the consortium has developed indicators to help schools judge how well they're doing at these foundational things. Reformers such as this are confident that they can judge which schools are succeeding and which are not with rubrics and metrics for accountability that track systemic effects, but without interfering with the activity of teaching to do so. What then about holding teachers accountable for their success at the activity of teaching itself? Teachers should indeed be held to account, but for the flourishing or failure to flourish of individual children along all the dimensions identified in the humanistic baseline for thinking about education: progress toward economic self-sufficiency, progress toward a capacity for social and cultural creation, and progress toward a capacity to participate in political life. Here it matters that the measures of system-level performance of the kind I just described from coming out of Chicago can be analytically connected to specific things that teachers do or fail to do, as in the case of the 9th grade on-track indicator, where students are more likely to be on track, as we've seen, when teachers develop strong student-teacher relationships and make high school relevant by making it future-oriented for their students and engaging them. Measures of system-level performance are most valuable when they are, as in this case, organically linked, as test scores are not, to specific features of the activity of teaching. Such indicators give parents and students much more powerful tools than test scores for holding schools accountable, because they give parents and students actionable policies and improvements to propose instead of the generic demand that schools raise scores. Policy alternatives, then, rest on answers to deeper questions posed by the logic of education as a practice. They carry with them implicit answers to the question of how we justify both a system of education and also the practice of actually teaching. By forcing to the surface our thinking about the two concepts of education, the state level and micro level concepts, I hope to have provided a framework to support more rigorous analysis of our policy options. By arguing for the importance of a humanistic baseline in thinking about what education is, I also hope to have restored some balance in our policy conversations, which tend to turn around the state-level concept of education. Most importantly, when we shift our gaze from the social to the individual justification of education and orient ourselves to the humanistic baseline, democratically defined, we are restoring the egalitarian potential of education in itself. The humanistic baseline requires that we think about the education of all students in the context of a broad notion of flourishing. Thus, the humanistic baseline reinforces an egalitarian orientation toward human dignity that can disappear if we focus exclusively on the state-level justifications, which instrumentalize the student. In my next lecture, I will turn to the topic of civic education, or to use more Arendtian language, preparation for participatory readiness. This is the policy domain in which the egalitarian potential of education, as such, most fully shows itself. Thank you for your attention.